Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, and I've got musical films running round my mind, a condition that doctors call singing in the brain. But it's incredibly appropriate because I'm extremely excited because the BFI, the British Film Institute, has just started running a fantastic festival of musical films. It's called BFI Musicals! So they know what they're talking about, the greatest show on screen. And it runs from now, October 2019, until January 2020, at venues across the United Kingdom. This is not just in London, this is everywhere. It's a programme of UK-wide events and actually comprises the greatest ever season celebrating the joyful, emotional, shared experience of watching film musicals on the big screen. Watching a musical film was something that you did in the cinema with your friends, your family, and indeed other people you didn't know to get that community engagement, just like the theatre. And this is a rare chance to see some fantastic films in the best possible quality, in the best possible environment. And whilst the season of films has been launched at the BFI South Bank, that's the old National Film Theatre, it is a UK event. There's going to be a family screening of The Wizard of Oz in Belfast Cathedral. There'll be an aquatic-themed musical in one of the last remaining Grade 2 listed Edwardian swimming baths in the UK. Closer to the end of the year, you'll be able to see White Christmas, that's the film rather than the weather condition, at Birmingham Cathedral. There'll be expanded screenings of Singing in the Rain from 1952 at Bristol and Liverpool. And there's going to be a UK-wide tour of films starring Barbra Streisand. There's also going to be a tour of Russian musicals in London, Bristol and Nottingham. In fact, 12 musicals have been identified for a tour across the United Kingdom, including First a Girl, Guys and Dolls, A Star is Born, Cabaret, Yentl, Calamity Jane, one of my favourites, Top Hat, the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers vehicle from 1935, Carousel, Sweet Charity, Paquisa, that's from 1972, Cabin in the Sky, 1943, and Singing Lovebirds from 1939. And as part of the wider season, the BFI will also be re-releasing 3 classic musicals in cinemas across Britain. That's Singing in the Rain from the 18th of October, Tommy from the 22nd of November, and The Umbrellas of Cherbourg from the 6th December. It is a fantastic festival. It's got so much to offer, and that's not all. There are talks, there are interviews, there are special guests, including Imelda Staunton, Patricia Ward-Kelly, that's the wife and biographer of Gene Kelly, Clark Peters, Kerry Ellis and Howard Schumann. And there's going to be more names added to that illustrious roster over time. So there's a one-stop shop to go to find out more about this magnificent festival. And that's www.bfimusicals.co.uk. Or you could also go to the BFI website itself, www.bfi.org.uk, and then it's oblique or slash, depending on your terminology, musicals. And if that wasn't enough, you'll also be able to see a whole number of musicals on the BFI Player, which is a streaming platform. There's really too much to talk about in one episode of Musical Talk. There's certainly too much to talk about in the introduction to a single episode of Musical Talk. But to give you a flavour of how exciting this is and some of the gems and delights which are available to be seen, because the list I've given you is very, very far from exhaustive, I met the very lovely Robin Baker, who's the head curator of the BFI National Archive, and he's the programmer of the BFI Musicals! Season. And what a joy it was to talk to him. He's a man who really knows his onions and has plenty of stories and insights to tell about some of the gems which he selected as part of the wider season of musical films available via the BFI across the United Kingdom. If you like musical theatre and do you know, if you're a listener to this programme, I'm pretty certain you do, then you surely also love musical films. And if you love musical films, you'll love this conversation with the charming Robin Baker. Musical Talk.
Hello, my name's Robin Baker and I'm Head Curator of the BFI National Archive, and I also happen to be the programmer of BFI Musicals, the greatest show on screen, which is about to take off at cinemas across the UK for the next few months.
Now, I must say I'm hugely excited at the prospect of this. I mean, I happen to love the BFI anyway, and it has, shall we say, branches everywhere. But I go and see a lot of things at BFI South Bank in particular, the old National Film Theatre, as I remember it. But this particular season is obviously tailor-made for listeners of Musical Talk because it's about musical films. But that is a big area. So I suppose I have two questions for you, neither of which I think are necessarily easy, which is, how did you alight on musicals as the way forward for the next season? And then, goodness, how did you cut that down to what you've selected, even over the sort of 3-month period of the festival?
It feels like absolutely the right time to be doing musicals. If you think of how the Hollywood musical was in decline for years, through the kind of late 60s, then suddenly just kind of fell off the edge. So with the exception of a handful of blips like Grease, it's been a bit of a wilderness the last 50 years. Almost.
If it weren't for Disney, it would be completely in the doldrums.
Absolutely. And suddenly we entered a world where, obviously there's Mamma Mia, and more recently there's been The Greatest Showman, there's been La La Land, there's also been a slew of Disney mega hits with Lion King and Aladdin, both north of $1 billion at the box office.
Quite.
So suddenly musicals are back, and musicals are back big time. And obviously later this year we've got Frozen 2, there's Cats, whatever that might be like. And the following year we've got Lin-Manuel Miranda and In the Heights, and also Steven Spielberg is doing West Side Story. So I don't know whether it's a little premature to say we're back in the new golden age of the big screen musical, but my goodness, there has not been a moment for 50 years that has felt like this, of musicals being so present and so successful at the box office. So to me, that feels right for right now. I also think politically in the world, no matter what your political beliefs are, no matter whether you are Leave or Remain,
within a British context. Yes.
Within a British context, you can't say that either the world or Britain is in a particularly good place at the moment. And when you kind of look at the history of the musical, or certainly the big screen musical, it's tended to have moments of success at times of anxiety or crisis. So in a way, it doesn't feel like an extraordinary surprise that the musical is enjoying success right now. So that feels like why we're doing it right now. In terms of how do you narrow it down...
Good luck on this one, by the way.
Well, I was going to say with a great deal of pleasure and huge stress, I would say. It's a combination of the two. We were never going to set out to try and survey absolutely everything. How can you?
Let's just briefly interrupt. In your own programme for October, just the beginning of the season, there's a quotation about the moment films talked, they sang as well.
Yeah.
So the history of the musical film goes way back. Well, let's be honest, the Jazz Singer is a musical.
Absolutely. And Hollywood had a really interesting time trying to work out what it was going to do with the musical. By 1930, so 2-3 years after The Jazz Singer, there were 100 Hollywood musicals made that year. Now, very few of them, in fact, I think none of them, have achieved kind of classic status. And Hollywood itself wasn't kind of sure about really what to do with them. It was churning them out, but not with a vast amount of box office success. And it wasn't really until a few years later, when Busby Berkeley came along, that you have that enormous flourishing creatively of the musical, but also the musical transforming itself into an understood genre of its own, and one that people were happy to pay to go to see.
I think Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers have a lot to speak for as well in the early 1930s. Obviously, that series runs through the 30s.
Completely. I mean, they are perhaps, if you think of Busby Berkeley handing over the baton after 42nd Street and Gold Diggers, he's almost handing it over to Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers.
But I think possibly you also see the development, or it seems to me, and you can tell me I'm wrong, because I'm very happy to hear it if I am, that you sort of move from the spectacle. I'm sure Busby Berkeley is much more than this, but there's spectacle, but we don't necessarily remember his stars, to the character-based versions that putting a star in or putting stars in who then semi-repeat themselves all the way through in accordance with the sort of the studio star system.
Yeah, I mean the numbers become very different in a way. For me, in a way, Berkeley is the one who really pushed the film form. It's much more, as you said, kind of star focused with Astaire and Rogers, and there was a kind of charm and delight in watching them that you're never going to get through watching Ruby Keeler, however much we like her.
Oh, she's much to be admired.
Yes, so. She's. I would say in the 21st century, she's something of an acquired taste, and possibly was even back then. The stars are a very different variety, and song and dance was not necessarily a required skill. Even Berkeley himself was not necessarily casting his legions of dancers based on their dancing skills.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that I think that we can remember his name. He's still, if not a household name, a well-known name in the history of film, this far after his death and this far after his sort of acme years, if you like, which isn't necessarily true of some of the earlier directors of what we might call straight film, straight drama.
It's very hard with almost any director, to put your finger on it and say, what exactly is it you remember about them? What is it you know about them? What is their stamp? All you have to do is look at a Busby Berkeley style top shot where you've got a kind of vision of joy in kaleidoscopic form. We all know what that looks like, and it's been parodied and ripped off multiple times.
Homaged, surely.
Well, maybe.
With love.
Whether it's kind of Disney's Beauty and the Beast, or whether it's The Big Lebowski, endlessly reworked. Even years later, Singing in the Rain does its own Busby Berkeley pastiche.
And the West End version of 42nd Street, which only closed earlier this year. It's cut from a similar cloth. It's from the similar period. There's a film of it. But it was borrowing a great deal from what we think of as the Busby Berkeley kind of way of putting something across. Yeah, including giving us a mirror. They had people lying on the stage doing the leg movements.
Yeah,
they gave us a raising mirror so we could see it in the stalls.
Yeah, exactly. You're never going to be able to get a camera or an audience, more to the point, 60 feet above the action.
Not easily.
In the theatre. But, they kind of cleverly used devices like that, as indeed they did in the film of The Producers, the musical film, where they use a mirror to achieve the effects that was clearly too expensive to be doing in the 21st century when you're making a big screen musical. What I find interesting particularly about 42nd Street in the West End is the fact that it is one of the many examples of the film musical going to the stage, where so often we tend to assume it's all the other way.
These days it more often is, isn't it?
So very, very, very often, but certainly not exclusively. I suppose what it's always been is, I suppose whichever way it goes, you have a product and the product is known and loved, and therefore you can milk more money out of it if you take the film to the theatre or you take the theatre to the film. And
yet people, certainly in those early days, taking us back to Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers then, briefly, Roberta, which is the Jerome Kern one, is it? Or certainly the Gay Divorce then, or the Gay Divorcee. The Gay Divorce being the stage musical first, made a film of, and they chop out most of the songs by Cole Porter and add lots of songs in, and that's going on. That went on for years and years.
That is so true of so many of the kind of great film musicals, and it's quite interesting in seeing how, I suppose, kind of canny producers are. Arthur Freed, who produced On the Town, MGM was not going to put out a Bernstein musical. It was not the kind of thing that was going to attract mass audience in the late 1940s.
A little too esoteric. Yeah.
Musically, far too esoteric. Much as I love the Bernstein score, and it's a joy to listen to it in the theatre or played by an orchestra, at the same time, it's not denying that listening to Ann Miller sing Prehistoric Man, which of course Bernstein did not write, is no less pleasurable at all. And it's happening over and over again, whether it's Kurt Weill's Lady in the Dark, whether it's Cole Porter's Du Barry Was a Lady. The theatre production was butchered. Do they end up as bad films? No, not necessarily. Some canny decisions are made.
And indeed, a film has to adapt or rather, a stage show has to adapt if it's going to become a film. Of course, it's a different medium. I agree with you absolutely. Funny enough, I was just thinking one of the films in the earlier part of the season, which is Funny Face, a gorgeous Gershwin score, brings me right in. And of course, one of the showpiece numbers is a non-Gershwin number, the Think Pink, which actually I think you've picked out in the catalogue as a particular highlight in that film. But it isn't a Gershwin song. Doesn't make it a less good film. Just makes it a Gershwin hybrid.
Completely. I think when they were writing new songs for films, it was a case of dramatic opportunity and also use of location, use of colour, as in Think Pink. Whereas Gershwin is not necessarily going to deliver that. The Gershwin songbook obviously reused multiple times across multiple musicals, but you can't expect it to deliver your full narrative. So again, the Bonjour Paris number in Funny Face offered huge opportunities for location shooting, which still was pretty unusual in the 1950s within a musical, and enables you to show the trajectories of three characters simultaneously. So all kinds of dramatic and location opportunities that if you were to stick simply with a Gershwin song, you couldn't do. You couldn't do, no.
It also highlights what we were saying a minute ago with that very particular number, of course. It gives you the opportunity to do something on film which you simply can't do easily on stage, the montage.
Completely.
And, you know, they, as you say, these three characters sort of wander around Paris having bunked off from each other. And then of course, meet up by chance at, what are you doing here kind of moment. But it's also another great song.
It's a great song, and it also looks fantastic on a big screen.
Which is how it should be seen, of course.
Completely. So, I always think with kind of, when you look at the film musical and the stage musical, they're delivering very similar things for audiences, but also some very, very different. And I think that business of being able to engage with character, being able to engage with location, being taken into action, and the box of tricks that you have as a filmmaker, you can't possibly have on stage. And that becomes one of those real things you gain. You might lose the immediacy of being in the presence of a live performance, but there are plenty of other things you gain to replace that.
Particularly on those large films, should we say, the fringe unit things you were mentioning. You know, so many of those are going to be on. I'm doing the action here on an audio recording, but I'm stretching my arms out wide. You know, the cinema scope, the Todd AO, the enormous screens that we think of. That is so immersive. I know you could argue that theatre is often immersive, but certainly in Britain, many of our best theatres are little Frank Matcham jewel boxes, but they're not necessarily always large. So actually, I do like the fact that you can, as you say, do things with a film that you simply can't necessarily do. That's a terrible sentence. That you simply can't do on stage. That space, that scope is broader.
Completely. You cannot get the Alps into a proscenium arch for The Sound of Music. It is not possible. So
you can't even get an Alp.
You can't even get an Alp. So suddenly, the opportunities you have as a filmmaker are quite extraordinary. When widescreen started being used in cinemas in the early 50s, where in a way it was a reaction to the arrival of television, the threat that people were suddenly going to start watching this little box in the corner of their sitting rooms, which they hadn't had before. Suddenly you needed a bag of tricks, and actually the musical was one of the best things for dealing with it, or learning how to exploit it. You know, musicals and biblical epics were probably the best ones for dealing with widescreen. But you've also got the other great trick they had up their sleeve was 3D, and my absolute favourite film shot in 3D was Kiss Me Kate. And
I've never seen it in 3D.
All I can say is you haven't lived. The film, when you watch it, whether you watch it in 3D or not, you, as long as you know that it was shot in 3D, you become very aware of the tricks they're playing throughout. So in Too Darn Hot, you'll notice Ann Miller kind of peeling off her pink gloves, and she'll throw it at your face.
Throw it forward, yes, of
completely.
Course.
Tommy Ryle, when he kind of is on a rope, he swings towards the camera, so he practically lands in your lap. There is
something for everyone there.
Exactly. There is no way of getting away from the fact that that is the 3D film and the joy of watching it in 3D. We're very lucky that we look after in the BFI National Archive a very rare 3D print of it. And so it's in fact two prints, and you project them simultaneously from an interlinked projector, and of course you have to wear polarized glasses to be able to see it, but my goodness.
It's worth it.
It's more than 3 times as good.
Funnily enough, I also like that self-referential thing you get in some of those films of the period. I'm thinking actually of the film Silk Stockings. Once again, we're back in Fred Astaire. And there's a song called Stereophonic Sound,
yes.
which is all about, look what we can do. They're sort of sending it up, but at the same time they're saying, but actually, look, we're going to do it. We're sending it up, but we're going to show you all the things we're sending up. And it's actually all a bit marvellous, isn't it?
Yeah, no, completely. It's referring back to cinema and reminding us that we are in that wonderful world.
Now, I'm afraid I diverted you from that question really early on, which was bearing in mind, and I think we've proven this very substantially in our conversation so far, it's a big field, musical film, from 1926 onwards. How did you boil it down? And forgive me, you've also, just a quick look at the catalogue for October alone shows you how inclusive you've been. It's not just American films, there's various films from across the world, including one from Soviet Russia, showing you the Russian take on the American kind of free junior musical. So you've wanted to get as much in as possible, but how do you make those cuts?
You make some very cruel and brutal choices. Really kind of started off with what are the core Hollywood musicals, and thinking in terms of what do audiences like, but also what do we think of as the high points of filmmaking. We are about film, we're not an organisation just about the musical, and therefore thinking what is cinema doing that is exceptionally good around the musical. So that was a kind of starting point. I wanted to represent diversity of filmmaking across time. So we're including things from the 1920s right up to the present. Again, made a choice that you might love all kinds of very recent musicals, but if they're on telly all the time, then less likely to include that. It was trying not to overdose too much on certain areas, though when it comes to MGM and the golden age of MGM, it's quite hard to escape that. And
it's the foundation stone in a way.
Completely. And also, increasingly, it's difficult to see those films on the big screen looking fantastic. So part of our reasoning was always, we want to give people, particularly younger audiences, an opportunity of seeing these films as they're made to be seen, not on your TV set with you sitting on the sofa, but you sitting with hundreds of other people enjoying them and it looking magnificent. Alongside taking a core range of Hollywood, I really wanted to say, well, actually Hollywood producing other films, that some of them might have been big flops, some of them might have been relatively minor, but we can still enjoy them and reappraise them. So we've included films like The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, which is among the most disturbing children's films I can possibly think of. It was written by Dr. Seuss. Made in 1953, and Beggar's Belief. It's like a Freudian nightmare. No, it's not like a Freudian nightmare. It is a Freudian nightmare.
It's a magnificent film in its way, and I saw it actually at BFI South Bank a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it is tremendous and terrible and wonderful in all that. It's grotesque as well. But it also has, I think, one of the greatest songs ever written for a musical film, which is "Come On and Dress Me." The Domi-Do Duds Dress Me Up song. A kind of Beggar's Belief. It sort of does.
It's like, how did it even get past the censor? I have no idea. Here's a man singing about how he wants to be dressed up in a marabou frill. Not what I would necessarily expect from a Hollywood musical of that period.
Very much hiding in full view, I think.
Completely. But one of the areas I was particularly interested in was, given how the musical really used technicolor so beautifully. And back in the 1940s, there we are in the heydays of 3-strip Technicolor, where real Technicolor looks, oh my God, the joy of watching it. I thought, well, here's a great opportunity to wheel out some rarities, but actually show them on original prints. At the BFI National Archive, we look after the world's largest collection of film. Gosh. And among that, we have a number of original Technicolor prints, dye transfer prints that are in exceptional condition. And so we're showing 5 of those, and all of them are relative rarities, things like Du Barry Was a Lady.
The Cole Porter piece.
Exactly.
That's Gene Kelly. And
it's Gene Kelly, Red Skelton and Lucille Ball.
Gosh.
And a fantastic turn, I have to say, from Virginia O'Brien singing a song called Salome. For me, the high point, absolute high point of the film. But we've also got films like I Love Melvin, which reunited Debbie Reynolds and Donald O'Connor just after Singing in the Rain. We've got Fred Astaire in The Belle of New York. We've got Doris Day in her debut It's Magic, known in the States as Romance in the High Seas. And we've got Broadway Rhythm, which is probably the most bizarre of the lot of them. It's one of those that is loosely adapted from a musical, but basically offers a series of turns. And the musical turns come from people like Lena Horne, who does two fantastic numbers within it. And then there's a great number by Hazel Scott.
Who's a less remembered jazz singer of the 40s, I'd say.
Pianist.
Oh, right, my apologies.
Yeah, no.
I should know that because I actually have one of her albums at home.
Oh, really?
So,
well, if you think of a 1940s Liberace, she is.
I'm now doing so.
She is a flamboyant pianist, but I just a bit like Oscar Levant in a way.
Oh well,
the
from the bandwagon.
The pianist can be a star of a movie, but she comes on, does a turn, and that's it. But best of all, and worth your admission alone, is to see the Ross sisters. The Ross sisters are contortionists, and the contortionist number in Broadway Rhythm is among the most extraordinary musical numbers you will see in any Hollywood musical. However, the thing that unites them all is they were shot in Technicolor and the use of Technicolor. Oh my goodness, the artistry of the production design, the costume design, the photography on how they're lit, so the colours just radiate.
It's sumptuous, isn't it?
It is completely. And there is nothing like watching a real Technicolor print.
It's like watching a film that's been filmed on velvet.
It's a beautiful way of putting it. The colours are so often deliberately chosen to be gaudy and clashing, but there is joy and magic in those films, and I think you start watching them in a very different way. I mean, you're not assessing, is this the greatest musical ever made? No, it's probably not actually, but is there deep pleasure that I've rarely found before? Absolutely.
Lots of ways of judging a work of art.
Completely. And I think it's a really good point. And I think those films, when they're watched in that kind of way, we see them through a totally different prism. And for me, it is rather like a prism of joy.
It's funny you should mention that sumptuousness of colour that comes from Technicolor as well, because there's an homage, let's use that word again, in La La Land. I think they every now and then they cut, well, this is my memory of it, is that they cut and saturate the colours, which obviously there's so much about that film which is playing with timescales and referencing back to us. Everything in it feels like it could have been filmed in the 1950s, early 50s, except for the occasional telephone here and there or things like that. But it always feels to me like it's saying we're not just making a musical here, we're also drawing some of the flavours from that period's filmmaking, which musical films and non-musical films were using, and the Technicolor process, I think, is part of that. Yeah,
I think Damien Chazelle kind of freely admitted how he has plundered the Hollywood musical. I mean, particularly in American in Paris, but you could name them over and over again. There's Funny Face, there's Singing in the Rain. But later, The Sweet Charity. I mean, it kind of goes on and on. It kind of starts actually with Jacques Demy and Les Demoiselles de Rochefort. So it's like a rich song. It's almost like a rich homage to a real diversity of the musical. But you're right, particularly the colour in musical, and he reproduces that really accurately and well.
And I think you get an odd. Funny enough, I think you get an odd disparity between two of the things we've spoken about in the famous West Side Story film. I think the first 10 minutes of that, the dance sequence in the street, which takes us back to that thing you can only do in film. I mean, the music is from the stage, but you can't really get a sense of place from the stage version of West Side Story. You can, and that first 10 minutes is remarkable. I once did a kind of slow motion scene by scene breakdown of it, and funnily enough you can see that from the shadows what time of day different scenes were filmed and the different numbers of people in the different gangs at different times. I think that 10 minutes at the beginning of West Side Story is in fact one of my favourite pieces of film, let alone musical film. But just to say, but then you cut to the film proper, if you like, when the plot kicks in and we see Tony putting the bottles out from outside the shop. And funnily enough, it's got the deep, saturated, rich colours of the period, but it's slightly stagey by comparison. So actually, I think there's a sudden handbrake turn about 10 minutes into the West Side Story film, the original one, where you move from this marvellous cinematic thing to not a slavish representation, but a closer representation of what you might have seen on stage.
Yes, I mean, it's much the same actually on the town. In as much you're lured into believing that this whole film's going to be shot on location in New York. And the opening sequences, I think there's only about 7 minutes of location footage on the town. But it's overwhelmingly wonderful.
Yeah. Draws you in, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. And once you've been kind of tempted with that you've entered the real world of New York, I think it's kind of felt, phew, we've done that now. We can actually cope with some sets, we kind of set the location, the kind of feel of it. But it does transform how you feel about the film. And I think for me, what's so interesting about New York and the musical is how much it recurs over and over again as being the destination to film your musical. Think of Barbra Streisand,
yes,
by the Statue of Liberty in Funny Girl, for example. I mean, it really is the great cinematic city, but particularly for the musical.
And do you think that's because it's always been an iconic city, or do you think that's because of its proximity to Broadway?
I strongly suspect it's a mixture of the two, where you've got musicals that have been written for stage, like On the Town and Funny Girl, which obviously is set in New York.
Yeah.
You're not going to change. But whatever we think of Los Angeles is not the most iconic of cities. It doesn't have the sense of visual splendour, scale, the buildings we universally all recognise. You're sort of struggling with locations in a way. So
it has a sense of name, but not the sense of place.
Completely. So it's not surprising that in a way New York is the uber cinematic city.
Now, which also brings us very neatly into one of the other things you've done in this season, which I'm very grateful to you for, which is it's not just a showing of films, it is also a few talks and other scattered bits and pieces. But let's talk about some of the talks, one of which is in fact about the iconic nature of New York in musical film in particular. So it's very interesting that we sort of stumbled on that in our conversation anyway. Yeah. But once again, how do you find what it is you want there to be specific talks and discussions about, from, bearing in mind that musical film is at the end of the day filmed drama, it just happens to have songs in it in exactly the same way that musical theatre is not different from theatre, it's just a form of theatre. So all drama is possible in musical films. So once again, we're talking this sort of huge landmass of possibilities. There are 4 or 5 talks in the first month of the seasons to begin with, more I hope to come. But how did they present themselves? Did you think must do one about New York, or did you have a brainstorming session of 48 options?
It's one of those things where you start thinking, well, there are so many musicals with New York. There must be something to talk about here, and it's going to look darn good on the big screen, and actually talk about why and how.
So I think almost from your position as curator of filtering what you could happen, or the films that you could pick, you also see trends in films which some of us may not, if we're not averse if we don't know the catalogue.
I suppose we were kind of looking at all the issues that we thought were particularly interesting about the musical. I mean, one thing that's always fascinated me is the default position of so many people of musicals being a bit of fluff. And so anything that was about trying to unpeel that and say, oh, come on, folk, look at the greatest musicals of all time, whether they come direct from theatre or from cinema, Showboat, West Side Story. They're about racism. Rent is about the AIDS HIV crisis. You can go on and on and on in how many musicals are dealing with serious issues. But giving a kind of prism through which people might look at the musical in a different way. So, for example, we've got an event looking at Busby Berkeley early on in the career, and looking at how his work relates to the Depression and the politics of that moment and what that meant for both Berkeley and the studio and what they were trying to achieve. So for me,
which is that first decade of talking films again, once again, isn't it? So it's also really fascinating from a cinematic point of view, not just a musical cinematic point of view.
Exactly. So for me, it's trying to unpick those narratives. And so the way we've kind of framed the discussions that we're having. So, for example, tonight, the day we're recording this, we've got our first showing of a Soviet film, Cossacks of the Kuban, which we're also showing at the end of October. That is a kind of absolutely joyful Soviet equivalent, I suppose, of the MGM musical in a way, about two rival farms. What I find so intriguing about it is the moment in which it's made. It's shot in 1949. It's said about two rival farms, and it starts off with the bounty of the grain harvest. We see all the happy Soviet collective workers working the fields, bringing in the grain. A year before that film was...
Not singing in the grain.
They are singing in the grain, I'm afraid to say. But the year before that film was shot, Russia had its last dire famine. 1.5 million people died because of the failure of the grain harvest. So one of the things that's going to be discussed in the introduction to that is that context. That what you are actually looking at is an overt piece of propaganda. It's saying things are okay, folks. We're just rolling in grain right now. But you start imagining how a Soviet audience that period would have been consuming that at the time, and the extent to which they'd be believing that propaganda, given the devastating effect the failure of the grain harvest had. So we're trying to unpeel stories behind musicals as well as being as celebratory as we can, because obviously your starting point is we love these things, we think they're joyous, we think they are some of the kind of high points of filmic creativity. And I think for me one of the frustrating things has always been that over and above Singing the Rain, the creativity of the film musical is not always acknowledged to the extent to which I believe it should be.
I agree with you. That's the downside of the MGM musical. In a way, it's become the shorthand for the entire genre. And can we really even call it a genre? It's almost a format of film, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a story told with songs. So there are several of these talks. You've mentioned them. I like the way that they actually shed light and colour on what's being offered up, giving us context, but also insight. And they're about, as you say, what could be more diverse, if you like, than discussing what you've just discussed there, which sits that kind of musical in with the American musical of 15 years before, when you were addressing or not addressing the Depression, and then the New York ones, which run all the way through, to today, let's be honest. So, and there are several others as well. Are there more to come over the course of the season? Because obviously at the moment, the research I've done on it is what is currently identified as coming up in the next few weeks. It runs through to the new year.
No, it does.
It's a lovely long season.
One of the talks we've got coming up in December is David Benedict talking about Stephen Sondheim on film. And David is Sondheim's forthcoming biographer. He's just completing the first authorised biography of Sondheim, so he knows his work inside out and back to front. And he's going to be dealing with how Sondheim's musicals have worked on film and also how they've not worked. Because you look at, I don't know if you've had the misfortune of seeing A Little Night Music on film, for example.
The Elizabeth Taylor.
Indeed.
Well, it's not an absolute misfortune.
Certainly compared to the pleasures of watching it in the theatre, it bears no resemblance.
It is better live, yes.
And, I've heard of various attempts to bring Follies to the cinema.
Gosh, how would you do that, though? Yeah.
Why would you? I mean, it is wholly a theatrical experience. All its joys belong in the theatre. So it would be utterly misguided to do so. So David, for example, will be talking about the challenges, actually, of how you bring successfully Sondheim to the big screen. What we're also really interested in doing is looking at working with people who performed musicals and bringing their knowledge and experience into how we look at those films. So, for example, we have Clark Peters talking about Sweet Charity. We've got Imelda Staunton talking about West Side Story. We've got Carrie Ellis on The Wizard of Oz, because they not only have passions for these, but because they have been involved in theatre and sometimes theatre productions of those musicals, they have their own kind of perspective on them.
It's a compare and contrast in one or two cases, but it's all from love, isn't it?
Completely. I suppose it should come as no surprise that people who perform musicals also love them. So we have Tommy Steele coming in December.
Goodness.
Not so much to talk about his own career, but about his own passion, particularly for the early years of the Hollywood musical. And I think those kind of insights you get from people who've been absolutely at the top of their game in performance, and how you therefore see the musical, is a really rewarding experience to have.
Although the interesting thing about Tommy Steele, just taking that one name from the array that you've mentioned, I'm just thinking about the British musical film, which is not represented hugely, but then again I think we have to be honest and say it's never been. Well, I think the catalogue for October says it very plainly. It's the 1930s is the highlight of the British film industry for musicals in some senses. And I see you very wisely chosen Gracie Fields over George Formby as the two great musical stars of the period. I love George Formby, but those films are what they are. And then suddenly, Tommy Steele, of course, he's doing a lot of stuff on stage, but Half a Sixpence ushers in, if you like, a small mini revival of the British musical in the 60s, really, I think.
Yes, I mean, in a way, it's Hollywood enabled,
yes.
Because those
It's
big
a great
musicals.
phrase, by the way.
Well, it's true. I mean, it would not be possible without Hollywood studios suddenly thinking, in the 60s, Britain's a funky place to come and work.
Yeah.
We can make some money here. Because London was swinging, Hollywood was interested. So suddenly there was a moment of opportunity in the 60s for some big musicals. Not all of them are hugely successful. We're showing a 50th anniversary screening, very rare screening, of Goodbye Mr. Chips with
Peter O'Toole.
O'Toole and Petula Clark. And again, Oliver being a good example of one that, without Hollywood money, those films would not be made by the British film industry. So we got our fingers burned so many times. I suppose the most famous burning is a film called London Town from 1946 with Sid Field, a very young Petula Clark actually, who plays his daughter in it. I think she was about 12 or 13 at the time. It was the first starring role of Kay Kendall, and shot in Technicolor, cost a fortune, lost a fortune, and it was like bye-bye musicals for a long time. And we kind of got by for many years, really using, I suppose, kind of popular musicians. And actually that was one of our big discussions early on in the programme, about the extent to which the band musical was going to be in or out. And we very largely kept it out because it was such a big field. And it was also that questioning of the extent to which some of them are musicals or not. Very recently, Bohemian Rhapsody, lots of people were calling a musical. Do I think it's a musical? No, not really. I don't actually. It's a film with lots of musical numbers.
It's a biopic with music.
Yeah,
play with music is different from a musical.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really hard one to define, and in fact, that's another one of the discussions we've got coming up, and one I'm chairing actually. So I need to work out my answers for this. What's my thinking? But it's around how do you actually define a musical? Because I'd start off by saying, well, if all the numbers are performed on a stage where a band is performing or an act is performing on stage, a bit like the recent Lady Gaga A Star Is Born, is that a musical?
Diegetic and non-diegetic music.
Completely.
Yes.
So is that really a musical? And say probably not. But then you think, well, in the film version of Cabaret, with the exception of Tomorrow Belongs to Me, all the musical numbers are performed by performers standing on a stage performing to an audience. So it becomes very hard to have a really clear, user-friendly definition of what you believe a musical is or isn't. As I said, though, for me it was always around how creatively is the filmmaking really about exploiting the medium of film. I'm really enjoying that. And Cabaret for me is a great example. I think it's a darn good stage show, but I think the film is far superior.
And does that thing which, I know it's not a musical, but The Third Man does. It takes a British story with a British central character and then actually casts an American. And in both cases, makes a slightly stronger work of art in some sense, or it could be argued that they make stronger works of art.
Cabaret improves on the original stage show, and whether or not it improves, it's so different, I suppose, in a way from the original
From the book,
issue.
yes, right.
But it makes some really canny choices. It's much more sentimental, the stage show. One of the kind of main counterpoints is an elderly couple who are completely removed. You've got a number of numbers that take place not in the Kit Kat Club that are, let's say, not so great. And so wisely chuck those out. And you up the divine decadence, you make it sleazier, nastier, and actually far more political. It's a much more disturbing film than it is a stage show. And actually one of the greatest choices is to change some of the songs performed in the Kit Kat Club. So Money Money, maybe this time, Mein Herr, all newly written. And you somehow can't imagine that. You can't imagine Cabaret without them, and I think almost every theatre production now manages to shoehorn them in.
I can guarantee that's the case.
Because they are so fantastic. But I think one of the great difficulties is how you escape a towering performance like Liza Minnelli. That said, I wish I was old enough to have seen Judi Dench perform Sally Bowles on the West End stage.
She sounds fantastic on the recording.
It's an amazing, and a devastating performance when you hear her sing the title song. It is heartbreaking. Yeah,
she's no slouch.
She certainly isn't.
Robin, I could talk to you for weeks about this, I think, because I've enjoyed this immensely, but I fear that this conversation must come to its natural end. So I'm going to give you two very quick questions. The first is, what are the dates? How can people see the shows, or how can people see the musical films which are part of this season? And then the tremendously ridiculous but an invidious question, do you have a favourite and what is it?
Right. The programme runs at BFI South Bank from the middle of October, i.e. now, as we're speaking,
yes, quite.
Right the way through to the end of December. However, it's taking place across the UK from now until the end of January. So there are literally hundreds of cinemas and community venues around the UK participating in
Which
this.
is wonderful to hear, by the way.
It was absolutely our starting point that this was going to be a project that we wanted everybody in the UK to be able to join in. If you go to bfimusicals.co.uk, that will list all the events. I'd say keep coming back because there'll be more and more listed all the time for that. In terms of my own favourite musical, obviously something I think long and hard about all the time, I will never, ever escape from the joy that watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang as a 4-year-old gave me. I know every song off by heart. I had the soundtrack album as a 4-year-old, and I used to dance up and down our hall with my father singing those songs. So, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang aside, it would have to be a tie between Cabaret and Singing in the Rain.
And what different tones they have.
Completely. And what I find odd about the musical is its ability to bring total joy and also put you through the mill. And I think what's so great about musicals, they are about catharsis. They enable you to experience the very biggest of emotions, and however big and sometimes however terrible some of those emotions are, you come out feeling great.
Robin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your insight. It's been wonderful. As I say, I could literally go on forever. It has been a conversation which has been truly scrumptious. And I know you know what I mean.
Thank you very much indeed.
Musical talk. And there we have it, the wonderful Robin Baker, the head curator of the BFI National Archive and the programmer for the BFI Musicals, ! The greatest show on screen film season. There is definitely something for everyone there, and more than one thing, I should wager. I've certainly had a look, and even just the film scheduled for the first few weeks, taking me up to the middle of November, there is a wealth of things I want to see, possibly too many. Certainly too many if I want to go to work or have a meal occasionally. But I'm not going to let that stop me. And as I think you heard in that conversation, I think Robin and I could have spoken for a very much longer time about a whole host of further films coming to the season and teased out some more anecdotes, stories, themes, and, as you heard, shared enthusiasm. And I must give my huge thanks to Robin for giving me time at what must be a super busy period for him, and for being so charming and so generous with his stories, insight and passion. And I should also thank Liz Parkinson of the BFI's Public Relations Department who set the interview up. Do go along to the websites to see if there's something that you'd like to see. As I've said already, there's so much to choose from. I haven't even mentioned the fact there are 100 newly digitised musicals-themed TV programmes available to watch for free in the BFI Mediatek at the BFI South Bank. Or the tie-in release of the Blu-rays of Yentl, Les Demoiselles de Rochefort and Hair on the BFI Home Entertainment label. So, what are those websites again? www.bfimusicals.co.uk or www.bfi.org.uk/musicals. But of course there's nothing oblique about the musical season at the BFI. It's going to be colourful, tuneful, but most of all, fabulous. Thanks very much for listening to this episode of Musical Talk. Don't forget to join us again soon for another, and I'm sure we'll be discussing some of the films that you can see wherever you are in the country in future editions. But for the time being, it's really time for me to say goodbye. In fact, that time has arrived now. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2019. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. What I was going to do is I'm just going to actually...
Where should I sit? Like
out
this?
there, but I wonder if you might... I've got a little gauge on this side. Do you
Fine.
mind just giving me a conversational...
Yeah, my name's Robin Baker and I'm Head Curator of the BFI National Archive and I'm also the programmer of BFI Musicals!